Greetings! Today I'd like to talk about using quotation marks in quotations. That, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Okay, when a person or work is quoted directly and word for word, the quotation is placed in quotation marks. That's known as a direct quotation. Sometimes we use indirect quotations in which the substance but not the exact wording is used. If you do that, that does not take quotation marks. And let me give you some examples. Okay, here we have a direct quotation from Shakespeare's play, Macbeth. Macbeth said, "All our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death." It's a direct quotation from the work. It's introduced with a he said, she said clause, separated by a comma, and then open quotation mark, and at the end of the quotation there's a closing quotation mark. Perfect example of what we call a direct quotation. Now, we could use, for example, an indirect quotation. If we say, Macbeth said that their past actions lead fools to death, that's a summary. It's not exactly what the work says. So we do not use quotation marks because it's not a direct quotation. It's not a word-for-word quotation. A lot of times the word "that" is a good clue that it's an indirect quotation. Sometimes only part of a quotation is used, or the writer uses a quotation without a he said, she said clause in a presentation, and this a lot of times, especially if it's in the just part of a sentence, is known as an embedded quotation. In this case, no special punctuation or capitalization is used other than what is in the quotation. And let me give you an example of that. Macbeth said that their past actions lead fools to dusty death. The only direct quotation are these two words, dusty death. Otherwise, it's a summary, so we put dusty death in quotation marks, open quotation mark, closing quotation mark after the period. And this is a good example of embedded quotation. Embedded quotations are frequently used for definitions. So, for example, the Random House Dictionary defines feign as gladly or willingly. Again, gladly or willingly is a direct quotation from the dictionary, tells us what it means, and that goes in quotation marks as well, without any other special punctuation. Now, if a question or exclamation is quoted directly, the quotation contains the question mark or exclamation point. If the question or exclamation is at the end of the quotation, the question mark or exclamation point comes before the closing quotation mark. So let's give you some examples. Okay, look at that, he exclaimed. Did you see that? Okay, look at that. Exclamation point comes before the quotation mark. Did you see that? Question mark, again, comes before the closing quotation mark. Okay, good example of this rule, using both the exclamation point and the question mark. By the way, if you see in an exercise, on your test or something like that, a word like exclaimed or maybe shouted or something like that that puts a lot of emphasis, that's a good clue that you should be using an exclamation point rather than a period or comma. Okay, you can find a question mark outside the closing quotation mark if the sentence is asking about a quotation, but the quotation itself is not a question. Okay, let me give you an example. Did Mark Antony say, "Friends, Romans, countrymen"? Okay, that is a quotation from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, but it's not a question itself. So it would be punctuated this way. The closing quotation marks would come before the question mark because it's asking a question, but the quotation itself is not a question. Now you might be wondering, what about, and this is rare, where the question is about a quotation ending in a question? Then the sentence ends with a single quotation mark before the closing quotation mark. I mean, single question mark before the closing quotation mark. Okay, so who said "et tu, Brute"? Okay, there, "et tu, Brute" is a question. The whole sentence is asking a question, but you only use one question mark, and that goes before the closing quotation mark. Again, not real common, but I guess it could happen once in a while. I do want to mention some authorities, especially in the British Isles, may use a period after a closing quotation mark when a quotation includes an exclamation point or question mark, but the whole sentence containing the quotation is declarative. Okay, not generally practiced in North America, but you might see this on occasion from something from the British Isles. Okay, always place a comma or period before the opening or closing quotation marks. So here we have a "he said, she said" clause in the middle of the quotation. So there's the comma, but it goes before the closing quotation mark. The second comma after requested goes before the opening quotation mark. And then the ending period goes before the closing quotation mark. So commas, periods always go before the quotation marks, whether they're opening quotation marks or closing quotation marks, with those few exceptions I talked about in the British Isles, where they might do things a little bit differently. Okay, always use a comma or colon, could use a colon, after an introductory "he said, she said" statement. And colons, remember, are just used for formal or long quotations. So, "he said, I like peanut butter." Okay, again, the comma comes right after the "he said, she said" clause and before the opening quotation mark. If the quotation is a single sentence and the "he said, she said" clause is in the middle of the quotation, a comma leads into the second half. "Mary, comma, he asked, comma, do you like peanut butter?" Okay, again, the comma goes before the closing quotation mark there, before the opening quotation mark here, and of course, quotation mark follows the question mark at the end of the sentence. Okay, if the "he said, she said" statement in the middle of a quotation separates two sentences, then the "he said, she said" statement ends with a period. "I like peanut butter," comma, close quotation marks, "he said," or "he proclaimed," period. "Can you swim?" Okay, period, open quotation marks. Okay, so in this case we've got two separate sentences, so the "he said, she said" clause in the middle ends with a period. Always place a colon or semicolon after closing quotation marks. This is pretty rare. Very rarely do you see this used, but here we have, again, two clauses that are seen as independent clauses, part of the compound sentence. George claimed, "I have 20 points. Bill said he only had 12. Okay, for some reason you want to use a semicolon to combine those two sentences. The semicolon would go after the closing quotation mark. Again, rarely used, but if it does come up, that's what it looks like. Also, begin a new paragraph with every change of speaker. So, notice this is hard to follow. In fact, sometimes it's not even, it's hard to tell, "Hi Jeffrey, how are you?" Oh, okay, yeah, that can't be Jeffrey talking, right? So, it's just a little hard to follow, where if you have the new paragraph for every time the speaker changes becomes a lot easier to follow. Hello, Mary Jeffrey Stanley. Hi, Jeffrey, how are you? And we understand that's Mary's response. Fine, what have you been doing lately? Okay, we understand that's Jeffrey talking. So it's just a lot easier to follow. So keep that in mind. If you have any kind of dialogue with, using quotation marks, you make a new paragraph for each change of speaker. And for quotations longer than a single paragraph, you put quotation marks at the beginning of each paragraph, but only at the end of the final quoted word. An example of this comes from the end of A Tale of Two Cities, where Sidney Carton is speaking, or at least imagine he's speaking. And so the first paragraph, of course, begins with the open quotation mark, but the quotation goes on to a second paragraph, so there's no closing quotation mark at the end of the first paragraph. There is an open quotation mark at the end of the second paragraph to let us know that there is, it's still part of the quotation, and then finally closing quotation mark at the end. Again, not real common, but you do see it once in a while with long quotations in novels, stories, and things that aren't formal writing. Now, you might recall that if you're writing some kind of formal non-fiction writing, like a term paper, an essay, something like that, then if you're quoting 4 or more lines, you don't use quotation marks and you indent every line. So this would be okay. Dickens wrote is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It's a short quotation, you put that in quotation marks, and that's fine. But if you are quoting a longer piece, obviously more than 4 lines, then for term papers and formal nonfiction, you would introduce the he said, she said clause. Dickens wrote with a colon, and then the quotation, each line would be indented. Same indentation as you would use for a paragraph. You might recall that from your term paper lessons. Okay. One other piece, this is just kind of something, we tend to use the word quote if we're talking about someone quoting something. Also, we tend to use it when we're talking about a quotation, and sometimes we talk about quotes when we're talking about quotation marks. For example, we talk about air quotes, something like that. But in formal or standard written English, you should make a distinction. So, quote is a verb. He can quote the Gettysburg Address by heart. Quotation is a noun. Now, in informal English, the word quote is sometimes used, especially when speaking about a proposed price or something like that. But in formal English, you should say the quotation for the repairs was too high rather than the quote. And quotation mark is a punctuation mark. And again, in standard, formal English, standard written English, you would say something like, that sentence goes in quotation marks. But in informal speech, we sometimes use the word quote for all 3. But in formal writing, you should make a distinction among these. So that's it for rules on using quotation marks. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in class. If you're not part of the class, you can always go to englishplus.com and look at the contact page, and somebody will be happy to ask you questions there. Thank you very much.